Luck was with us because he had his pants on. Jake followed, and when the door dropped down again, it was a full house. We hunkered on the wet stones, our knees intermingling. Sparks shook a gallon of rainwater over us. Colonel Hazelrig fought for breath. But he rallied. "Keep your heads down, boys," he said. "Them Rebs can see around corners, and for the sake of the girls and women you left behind, keep your powder dry." The colonel could be clear in his mind, sometimes for long stretches, but any quick change, anything sudden, and he was back fighting the Civil War. The wind roared like a freight train, and Sparks clawed the floor, trying to get lower. Then came that awful silence, and you could feel the air being drawn out of your lungs. The light through the chinks was sulfur yellow. We were in the eye of the storm. "Boys," the colonel said, "let us pray." You lose track of time, but by and by the wind came round again. The rain drove in waves, punishing the door. Every time a big limb struck it, we rattled around like a box of loose parts. A while longer, and the wind began to wind down. You could get your breath back. "Never trust the quiet," the colonel warned. "Be not deceived. They's a sharpshooter in every tree, a skirmisher back of every bush. One of them bullets could be engraved with your name." Aunt Hat sighed. When we couldn't even hear a spatter of rain, Jake shouldered the door open and it fell back. Black clouds boiled above us. Sparks leaped out and charged off in every direction. It appeared to be night to him, and he was looking for a moon to bay at. Jake pulled the colonel out, and I followed. Between us, we set Aunt Hat on her pins. She looked around. Not a window pane of their sloping old house was cracked, but the big lilac bush beside it was nothing but naked twigs now, rising from a drift of purple snow. The grape arbor was pretty much down to tendrils. The colonel's bold nose consulted the wind, and his old eyes blazed. Leaves whipped out of his white hair. He was a sight, but seemed to think the rebels were in full retreat. Aunt Hat had on the Civil War forage cap she wore for a gardening hat. Her skirts were tucked up in a web belt also from the war. She wandered off to count her chickens. Down by the road, the garage still stood, even the canopy. Our house next door, Jake's and mine, survived, though with fewer shingles. The colonel turned on us and seemed to sheath his sword, but he was naturally not allowed anything sharp. Though a dead ringer for General Robert E. Lee, he was fighting on the other side. "All present and accounted for?" We were, so Jake thought we'd head uptown to see the damage there. The air was still full of stuff. "Strike the tents," the colonel commanded, and we headed out. We all lived on the outskirts, way out in the weeds. Between us and town was the Beulah Land Cemetery. The road was a mess, every hoofprint brimming with rainwater. Out in the ruts, we saw trouble. A shade tree out of the middle of the graveyard was crossways in the ditch. Great big tree with the loose dirt blowing off its roots. A bald buzzard thudded down in the field opposite. It was the spitting image of old Judge Ransom. Jake muttered something and broke into a lope, though when you think about it, there was no real hurry. A woven wire fence enclosed the cemetery. That's as far as Sparks went. The fur rose all down his backbone, and he whined and talked to himself and edged backwards. I wasn't overjoyed myself. We went in by the gate, and all the pathways were blocked with wet brush. We knew a good many of the residents, though the oldest part went back to the 1830s. I looked for Othmar Gunderson, though he was before my time. Othmar Gunderson, 1844 to 1897, late teacher of Hoosier Grove School, struck by lightning while returning from the school outhouse. Ah, sweet mystery of life. And would you believe it? There was my cap, right there on top of the Gunderson gravestone, like the tornado had gently placed it there. I grabbed it and caught up with the Colonel and Jake, pushing through fallen limbs ahead of me. Jake looked back. "Peewee, this is about as far as you need to go." The twister had skipped across the graveyard like a stone across a pond. Every whipstitch you could see the earth turned up in big, raw heaves. There was stuff in the trees, too, that ought not to be there. My heart was in my mouth. I looked past the Colonel and Jake and saw the tornado had opened a grave. The coffin was thrust up and the lid of it elsewhere. At least it wasn't Mama. I was sure of that. Mama was buried under a willow over by an open field. So, of course, like a fool, I had to take a look. The coffin was half out of the ground at a sharp angle. It had a mahogany finish. The metal label screwed to it read, "Every wood part guaranteed stove-dried. Apex Cabinetry and Coffins, Bean Blossom, Indiana. All work to your specifications. Never a complaint." The Colonel was examining the coffin's contents. He pulled on his beard, and I supposed he thought he was at Gettysburg. But I was wrong. "Why, looky there. If that ain't Gladys Poundstone. Gladys Gilmore as was. I took her to the victory ball the Republicans give when U.S. Grant was elected in 1868. Howdy, Gladys." Jake was looking around for the lid. I peered past him into the coffin. Being 14, I often acted before I thought. What I noticed first was that Gladys Gilmore Poundstone's hair had kept growing, long after death. It flowed a yellowed white from her gray skull down to cover most of her face, mercifully. Across her sunken bosom, her hands were clasped, and there was precious little flesh on them. Her fingernails had kept on growing, too. You don't want to know how long. Her dress was several stained shades of green and long out of style now. I was thinking about being sick. "Well, dog my cats, Gladys." Colonel Hazelrig shook his old head. "Imagine you turning up after all this time." Jake found the lid and brought it back. It had screwed down, but the screws were sheared. Never mind, he and I both had pockets full of nails. I always kept the ones I found in punctured inner tubes. Jake was never without a claw hammer on his belt loop. He was building an automobile of his own design from parts, so he was a walking tool chest. I breathed easier after we got the lid back on. Without shovels, we couldn't bury it again, but we could make the lid tight against critters until the gravediggers could get out here. I turned to go over and check on Mama, just to be sure. "Peewee, don't go that way," Jake said with a nail in his mouth. "Go around." But why go around? Anywhere you turned was skinned bark and brush up to your... Then I saw. There was something up a tree between here and Mama. I wanted it to be a wad of old rags. But if it was, they were wearing boots. Still, I wanted it to be anything but what it was. A scarecrow, maybe? It wasn't. It was a skeleton in the rotten rags of a dress suit and boots. The boots had wooden soles, so he dated back a ways. The tornado had dug him up, blown him out of his box, and wedged him in the high crotch of a Dutch elm. From his raggedy coat sleeves, finger bones hung down. I gagged. "I can't call him by name offhand," the Colonel remarked, "but he belonged to the Masonic Lodge. You can see his apron from here." I retched. By now I was crashing through the undergrowth, making for Mama. I was nearly there when something soft and damp slapped my face. I reined in and pulled back. It was a sickening pink with fringe, blanket-sized and snagged to 2 trees, like laundry on the line. It was a shroud, shell